Africa and the United States of America. What's the relationship between these two entities? And does it make sense to be asking what's the relationship between the United States of America, a country, and Africa, a continent of 54 nations, very diverse nations with complex histories and identities? Some countries in Africa are larger than the entirety of Western Europe. Okay. The Congo itself is larger, just one country in Africa, larger than the entirety of Western Europe. So, does it make sense to be talking about the relationship between these two? But no matter, okay, because the U.S. African Leaders Summit is going on right now. Right now in Washington, D.C., there's the U.S. African Leaders Summit, the second one. Okay. And the last one was held 8 years ago by President Obama. In 2014, President Obama had the first summit. And one of the things that comes to mind, obviously, is, well, why has it taken 8 years for this next summit to happen? Why the inconsistency, the seeming inconsistency? We hear all the time about China being in Africa, some other Eastern Europe, well, countries like Turkey as well, being in Africa, investing, quote unquote, taking advantage of and, reaping some of the benefits in terms of what they see in Africa. Well, what are some of the things that one sees in Africa? Well, generally speaking, there is the idea of Africa being the place where you go and extract resources. You go there and you get your mineral rights, you get the stuff that you need, you take it over to your country and you develop it. Well, we know about the blood diamonds, we know about the coltan in your cell phone and other such things like that. So we're going to be reviewing excerpts from a video. Okay, Mr. Mvemba Fezo Dizalele is a senior fellow and director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, located in Washington, D.C. And let's begin here with this notion of why it took so long to have the next summit. Why 8 years between the summit? Why the inconsistency?
The history of the first summit and why it's taken 8 years to get to the second.
I think that has to do with the way that the United States works. When it comes to Africa, the US has never been consistent. We don't have a US Africa policy in the way, let's say, we have a policy for the Middle East, or we have a policy with NATO or European countries, the EU, and so forth. So often, Africa engagement from the United States is left to either the political whims, depending who controls the White House, who controls the Congress, or whatever the president wants to do. So it's not consistent. President Obama held the first summit in 2014. By the time he had visited Africa a couple times, had been to Cairo, to Ghana, to Tanzania, South Africa, and Senegal. So when he held the first summit, there was tremendous momentum. But then he himself, President Barack Obama, that is, did not hold the second summit in 2015, neither did he hold one in 2016. Then we had the years of President Trump. Those were the years of America first. There was a different type of emphasis. Africa was not a priority. Next thing we know, it took 8 years. And that's not acceptable because 8 years is the equivalent of 2 presidential terms.
Indeed. Okay. So the general trend of deglobalization that we're seeing, where, whether it's Brexit, saying British people first, or the America first impulse that we're seeing, is a general geopolitical and economic trend. Okay. There are reasons, demographic reasons, economic cycle reasons why this is taking place. Okay. We know, for example, that China is acting a little bit belligerent, and there are companies that are trying to diversify their supply chain, generally speaking. So that's the environment that we're in with regards to African engagement. So let's talk a little bit about why would the United States, for example, even be interested in engaging with Africa? Well, what does Africa have to offer other than the natural resources that we talked about before? Well, the demographic picture does look very good for Africa. The average African is how old? Well, guess 19 years old. The average African is 19 years old. The average German is 49 years old by comparison. We know that China is aging. Okay. Now, why is this important? Demographics controls everything when it comes to the large economic cycles of nations. Okay. Well, why is that the case? Well, you can just think about your life or the life of an individual. When you're aging, that's not the time when you make investments. That's not the time when you take risks. That's not the time where you go borrow extra money on your credit card and say, you know what, I'm going to grow into it. I'm going to make more money in the future and I'm going to be able to pay. Get the picture? So when a population is fairly young, there can be a lot of investment. There's obviously a lot of labor, right? There's obviously a lot of labor, a lot of vitality, but there can be a lot of investment. When you're aging, you're not going to be building massive condos for whom? This is the time of hibernations. This is the time of pulling back. This is the time where growth slows down. The slow down in the growth in China, for example, is as a result of what we see in terms of its demographics. So, number one, we mentioned the resources. Number two, we're now talking about the fact that Africa has got great demographic situation going for it in the sense that it's rather young comparatively. But what are the expectations for this summit, if you will? What are some of the expectations? What are people looking to get out of it? What's President Biden, whom is holding this second summit, the second one in 8 years, what is he looking to get out of it? Let's listen to a little bit of that.
In the Wall Street Journal today, the headline, Biden's Africa Summit set to aims to reset ties. A lot of discussion there about the competition with China and Russia when it comes to Africa. Talk a little bit about the ties between China and African nations and between Russia and African nations.
So a couple of things there. One is that China has been engaged with Africa since the beginning, before the independence movement, right? China helped a lot of African countries as they were fighting, African colonies at the time, they were not independent yet. As this independence movement were fighting against colonial powers, China often stood with them, providing technical assistance, providing military training, providing various types of support that this movement needed. China was not rich at the time, but China was able to send its technicians, its experts to work alongside African countries across the board as those countries became independent. They gave scholarship, they did a large spectrum of engagement. Russia, similar. So if you look, for instance, at South Africa during the years of apartheid, the United States and the West stood on the wrong side of that development there. The US for a long time, and the French and everybody support the apartheid.
Again, mentioning some political reasons why it may be the case that there are strained relationships between, some nations at least, or the notion of Africa as at least, and the United States. That the fact that during apartheid in South Africa, the United States didn't really come through strong against apartheid, right? So that's some of the reasons, some of the background, some of the context.
The Russians were on the other side. They supported the Africans, not only in South Africa, in places like Angola, places like Mozambique, even Ethiopia, and so on. So the relationship that both of these countries have with African countries goes deep and long. So now, in today's time, China has become very rich. So they invest in big projects, infrastructures, construction, and also use their might on the Security Council of the United Nations to support their friends in Africa.
Okay. Right? We all know about the story of China investing in Africa, and some people talking about it some kind of neo-colonial move, which is quite debatable. It is debatable. Okay, let's continue.
Russia is similar. Russia also sits on the Security Council. Russia, however, engagement is a little more limited than China. Russia has its own challenges internally. You see them lending. They have a lot of defense agreements with a lot of African countries. And then as of late, you've heard certainly about this outfit called Wagner Group. But the Wagner Group at this point is only in two places. It's in it's in Central African Republic and in Mali. As far as the competition itself, I will say that the United States is not competing in Africa in ways that this narrative will lead people to believe.
Okay, so United States is not really competing out there. We got China, we got Russia. Okay, now what would move a capitalist system such as the United States to start making investments? Okay, remember he mentioned that there's an inconsistency in the American policy towards Africa, and it kind of just depends on the whims of Congress or whomever were particular leaders in particular aspects of the executive branch, right? Now, if a big time capitalist sees an opportunity in Africa, they will push the right buttons within the American system to get the politicians to change their policy towards Africa. But why is this not happening yet? Well, one aspect that one could look at theoretically is the fact that for capitalism to work, you need a liberal order. Okay. And this is not about democracy, because you could have an illiberal democracy. You can have a democracy where it's just the majority oppressing the minority. You can have all kinds of illiberal orders, okay? Because liberalism or liberalism in this kind of sense, political liberalism, is about fairness, equality, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the institutions that guarantee those. So we're talking about these Enlightenment principles of liberal democracy, okay? But the liberal part there is guaranteed by institutions such as an independent judiciary. So it's not just a question of voting, okay, and and going to the polls and stuff like that and being a democracy, but an independent judiciary, of which America has one of the best. Okay, now America is not perfect. Okay, many people might want to say, oh, how about this and how about that? There's lots of injustice in America. Look at the history of how they treated African Americans and many other things like that. That is true. But compared to what? Compared to what? Go try the justice system in Mexico, for example. Okay, see how you want to, would you rather get caught in Mexico or get caught in the United States? So these institutions, such as an independent judiciary, which fairly arbitrate and fairly, as fairly as possible, arbitrate the law and administers the law, is a very important thing for stability, which then allows capital to flow in. So again, America is not out there competing, as we have heard. Why is it not out there competing? Well, I would say to you that's because Africa doesn't have certain kinds of institutions. Africa does not have certain institutions, of which an independent judiciary is a very important one. So it's not just about, hey, look at all these resources we have here. Look at all these opportunities we have here. We have great demographics over here. The average African is 19 years old. It's going to be great explosive growth, manpower, all this stuff. But if you don't have a system whereby someone can say, these are the rules, and if I put my money here, it's not going to get voted away, it's not going to get stolen away, I have an independent judiciary that I can count on. Without that, it is hard for capital to flow. Now, when many people are posed or kind of given this notion of, well, how do we get from here to there? Okay, how does Africa develop? There is a kind of a vague notion of, well, Africa must unite. That's the idea. Africa must unite. If Africa unites, then things will be great. Well, let's see what he has to say about that notion, kind of promoted by Kwame Nkrumah and the Pan-Africanism, if you will. Now, this is something that sounds good. It's a good religious outcry. It's good for psychological, and it's a good therapy to talk about unity and what have you. But not only is unity so complex in a continent of 54 independent nations, that are some of which are bigger than the entirety of Western Europe, but unity of dysfunctional institutions is just going to be one big cluster F. Okay, it's going to be a huge cluster F of dysfunctional people that are united. Until you get good institutions such as an independent judiciary, then it doesn't matter. But let us continue.
Kwame Nkrumah philosophy of Africa must unite. Important philosophy, important way of thinking, I think, important framework. But as I said a few moments ago, Africa is 54 countries. African countries are not small. If you look at the DRC alone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's the size of Western Europe. That means it's 4 times the size of France. It's 1/3 the size of the United States. It's everything east of the Mississippi, from the border with Canada all the way to Florida. That's a huge country. That's just one country. By the time you get to Sudan, Algeria, and so on, it becomes very important to really implement this Kwame Nkrumah's dream. What I believe in, what is much more palatable and workable, is to have strong regional, what they call RECs, regional economic communities, like ECOWAS, like SADC, because then you have 5, 6, 7 countries that come together. If we can have strong regional integration and have these communities to work, then maybe several years down the road, we can start integrating regions until maybe we get to the thing. But the size is a problem. It's an important dream, but I think the realization really will be problematic. The European Union is only about 26 countries. And like I said, one country in Africa, like Algeria or Sudan or the DRC, are as big as Europe. So imagine integrating countries like that into one thing. it's very problematic.
So he mentioned the geographical limitations, the fact that Africa is very huge, one country being bigger than Western Europe, for example. Okay, that is one issue. And then he pointed out the fact that more realistic will be the idea of regional economic communities coming together and working out their issues. Okay, and this is because things are best done from a ground up situation with regards to solving problems. Okay, you need to build roads, you need electricity, you need infrastructure for both, channeling the water into the right places so you don't get floods, reclaiming the groundwater, cleaning the wastewater, providing potable water for people to drink, and all these kinds of things. Well, it's best done locally with you and your neighbor over there talking about that particular dam and that particular river. And hey, can we do a contract with you to get this particular resource? And then maybe you give us some of your engineering know-how to lay down these copper pipes. This is how you do things from a ground up level between you and your neighbor, cutting deals with each other, developing. And out of that, by the way, comes these institutions that we were talking about, that Africa needs these institutions. It needs institutions such as an independent judiciary that will emerge as a result of people working together to build those roads and build those dams and put that copper wire in the ground. Those things require a framework, a superstructure of institutions. And when you get these regionally, then you can start talking about the bigger picture of unity. So the idea that Africa to go from its current state right now to a better state, and that a state that is more, shall we say, attractive to capital, that it's simply a question of Africa uniting and all that. No, that's just a pipe dream, in my opinion. That's a pipe dream. That's a feel good kind of a thing. That's a black fist in the air type of thing. And that doesn't do anything. Okay. In real life, real boring things have to be done. And these things then create emanations of superstructures of institutions, okay, that allow those things to happen in the first place and allow for the contracts between you and your neighbor to actually happen in the first place. And then when you build those regional powers, if that makes sense, these regional economic communities, as he mentioned, then you can move forward into more larger, more complex unity, if you will. Okay. Now, final point we're going to go here is, well, what can America do to help foster these institutions that we're talking about? What can America do to help foster, maybe in particular regions or in particular countries, some of these institutions, some of these particular frameworks that will help then capital to flow in? Well, let's see about that.
We had a caller in our previous segment that had a question for this segment. So I'm just going to go off my notes. Eric was his name, an immigrant from Cameroon. He said that he remembered when former President Obama and then Vice President Biden met with the Ghanaian parliament. They said that Africa needed strong institutions, Eric said, not strong men. He said, I've never understood why America has been so silent about dictators in Africa. He said, the U.S. has been so loud about Putin. Why not dictators
Strong institutions, strong institutions, strong institutions.
in Africa?
Very good question from Eric. Actually, before I answer that, there's a second part to the question on the Berlin conference that the fellow asked earlier, and this is the influence of France. France has been actually...
He's talking about the Berlin conference right now. This is the conference that was held prior to Europe dividing up Africa. It was basically when they met and they said, hey, we're going to go and enslave, colonize, do all kinds of things, King Leopold and all that kind of good stuff. Okay. That's the conference he's talking about. And he's going to mention how France is not a particularly good player in Africa right now. The former colonies of France, okay, are experiencing rather ridiculous situations with regards to how France acts. Very heavy-handed, France is in its ways. But let's continue.
Actually, a negative influence in a lot of its former colonies. France has a very rigid and neo-colonial approach to African countries that it colonized, particularly in West Africa. They still control the currency there. France is very eager to conduct military operations. Africans at large are not excited about France. They're not happy with France. So we see this in places like Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, where they've had coups recently. How can the US work, help in that space? I think the US need to start challenging France. France is an ally, a strong ally, one of the oldest allies of the United States. So it's a bit challenging because the US needs France through NATO, the US needs France at the United Nations and in other settings. However, if the US want really to engage Africans and promote America's brand in Africa, for which Africans are ready, they need to start challenging France's position in the way they challenge China and other positions, because France is actually not particularly the best ally to have when it comes to Africa. To Eric's question, this has been a problem because the US is a big place. I'm talking about government here, not the average American. The US tend to think of the stability of the country. So while on one side, the US promotes democracy, there's the National Endowment for Democracy. We have organizations like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, SIPE, and so on, that work on democratization and good governance space. Sometimes and often, we do not always follow that through. So we have dictators in various countries in Africa, and the US still support them in the name of stability. This is problematic because that stability typically means the stability of that regime, not the stability of that country. And once that leader gets either overthrown or killed or chased out of the country, we often go to war. This is what we're seeing in a lot of countries in Africa, and the US can do better in that space. So Eric has a point there, and I agree.
Interesting point there. Interesting point there. Very interesting point. So the stability of some kind of dictatorial regime as opposed to the stability of a country. And this goes back to the institutions thing that I mentioned. If you have an independent judiciary, okay, and you have strong institutions with really deep roots in the traditions of the society that are respected, then it doesn't matter, okay, whether one regime is particularly propped up or not. Okay, there will be, it is the case, as a matter of fact, there is a paradox that dictators, okay, actually build up their regime at the expense of the state. If the state is a collection of institutions that can outlast a particular regime, then dictators actually build up their regime and minimize the state. Hence, when one dictator goes down, the whole state crumbles. The state did not exist. The institutions were never strong. It was all about that dictator. So for United States to, in a rather myopic, short-sighted way, support some dictators because they see it as stability without promoting institutions of the state that can outlast and form deep roots in a society such that it doesn't matter which particular regime is there, these things are going to continue and you have a nice continuum that will then allow capital to flow, okay? If that is not done, then things will not change. Will the United States challenge France? What are your thoughts about this? You can look up how France is treating its former colonies, especially in West Africa. Will the United States challenge France in that regard? Will the United States start to help with the fostering of institutions rather than the propping up of dictators, whom prop their regime up at the expense of institutions? It's one or the other. Okay, a dictator is not interested in having strong state, a strong institution. They want a strong regime, and they hollow out the state, and when they leave, things collapse. So, ladies and gentlemen, African Leader Summit, or the U.S. African Leaders Summit, taking place right now in Washington, D.C. The first, or shall I say the second one, in 8 years. The first one was held 2014 by President Barack Obama. Now we're having another one right now in 2022. Well, why did it take so long? Why did it take so long for this to happen? Well, there's a certain kind of inconsistency. America's not really competing in Africa. We've speculated as to why that might be the case. Institutions keep coming up over and over again. The importance of institutions, the most important of which, in my opinion, is an independent judiciary. So leave your thoughts below. Okay. Will you invest in Africa? What are the kind of conditions you would see before you go in there and invest? Well, I'm investing. I'm out there doing certain things, but I was born and raised in Africa. So that is slightly different. We're talking about people from the outside looking in. What kinds of institutions and systems would you like to see first before you go out there and take those kinds of risks, ladies and gentlemen. But we'll be keeping an eye on this summit, what comes out of it, if there's any follow through, and if things change in general. Once again, this is Iko Gammon, and until next time, peace.